Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman, and we're here with another video to help you improve your chess game. I thought I'd show you a game that was played earlier today. One of my students decided he wanted his lesson to be where he plays against an engine and then sort of talks to me during the game. Of course, I'm not helping him. We're just conversing, but I'm trying not to give him any hints or anything. So it was a 30-10 game. The engine played fairly quickly, so we were able to get it done in time. And I think the game was remarkable because, A, there was a lot of hidden tactics in the game, some of which I saw and I said, my student missed this tactic, and others that the engine saw after the game. So there was quite a bit of that. Pretty interesting game that way. The other interesting thing about the game was my student had really poor criticality assessment. His overall time management for the game wasn't really that bad. He was using up his time until the end game when he played way too fast. But he's tended to take more time than he should have on non-critical moves, and when he got to some of the most critical moves of the game, he played them rather quickly, and I call that a micro time management issue, and it's generally a criticality assessment issue, meaning he's not seeing how critical some of the moves are, and therefore he's not realizing those are the moves that should take more time. So let's take a look at the game. It's, as I said, a pretty interesting game. By the way, if you haven't told your friends about my channel, I always ask people at the start of the video, please do that. Tell them about Dan Heisman Chess. It's the best way to get the word around. All right, let's get looking at the game. He was black. The engine started out e4. He played e5, knight f3, knight c6, Italian game, bishop c4. At this point, my student paused, and he said, well, I don't know my openings very well. And then he mentioned that he could play bishop c5, which, of course, is the gioco piano, and he proceeded to play the two knights defense. And I was a little worried that he might not know the theory on the two knights defense, because two knights defense is very tricky. You don't want to play it if you don't know the theory. So the engine played the old main line, knight to g5. Some people erroneously call this the fried liver attack. No, the fried liver attack is what happens a few moves later if black plays it wrong. This is not the fried liver attack. This is just the classical variation of the two knights defense. My student played the main line d5. I've actually written 2 chess books on the two knights defense, a very, very extensive chess book on the Traxler counterattack, and another one on the fried liver and lolly. So black plays d5, e takes d5, and now knight takes d5 is the famous mistake. Knight takes d5 is only maybe the 4th best move here. And if you play knight takes d5 and then they play knight takes f7, that's the fried liver attack. If you play knight takes d5 and they play d4, that's the lolly, which is also good. You might think of the lolly as kind of a delayed fried liver attack, because if black plays bishop e7, which is a common move here, then knight takes f7 is even stronger than it is in the fried liver attack. All right, so anyway, back to the game. So my student knew not to do that. After e takes d5, he knew the main move, knight a5. So he knew a little bit more than he was hinting. And white played bishop to b5 check, which is the main move. Black played c6, again main move. Pawn takes, pawn takes. If we look at the database here, this position's been played 1,888 times in the master database on Lichess. But if we look at the amateur database, it's been played 2,284,000 times. Very, very popular line. And now, the old main line, the one that I studied when I was young, was bishop e2 here. But the engine has been telling people to play bishop to d3, which the engine thinks is slightly better. And the masters have been paying attention, because bishop d3, which was almost unknown, 30 years ago, has now become the most popular line in this position. If we look at the non-master database, the database of all the players, queen f3, which is actually a line, is the most popular. And believe it or not, the second most popular line is the move that my student played in the game. That the engine played in the game, which is bishop to a4. And bishop a4 is an almost unknown move in terms of master play. In fact, look at the database. It's really, really interesting. If you look at this position and we look at the master database, the only 3 moves played were bishop d3, bishop e2, and queen f3. So out of 1,888 games, it's always one of those 3 moves. Nobody played anything else. In the amateur database, Bishop a4 was played 547,762 times out of 2.2 million games, which is like almost 25% of the games. I think if you put your... Does it tell you the percent if you put your cursor on it? I forget. I guess it doesn't. It does in some cases. But in any case, it's played like a quarter of the time. Well, my student thought that was a normal move instead of a rare move. It's not rare at the amateur level, but it is rare if you're studying like opening books. At this point, he should really just stop and say, oh, I don't know the book from here. I need to stop and think. But he thought that he was still in like the major lines with bishop e2. So he kept playing fast here. So this is what I was saying was a micro time management mistake or a criticality assessment mistake. Because the first move where your opponent plays something that you don't know, you should stop and try to think. And he didn't do that. He just said, oh, I'm supposed to play h6 here. Well, I was saying to myself, gee, I don't even know this move, bishop a4. I don't know if you're supposed to play h6. It's probably a very good move, but you should at least stop and think about it. So my student kept playing fast, even though I'm already out of my book. So he plays h6, which I think the engine said is the best move. Knight f3, e4. These are all the main moves that you play when he plays bishop e2, but are they just as good when he plays bishop a4? Well, that's the kind of thing you have to kind of stop and think. So white plays queen e2. And if we look at the master database, there's no games, of course. But in the amateur database, this position was reached 91,553 times. And black most likely played bishop e7 in those games. My student decided to play bishop to d6, which is the fourth most popular amateur move. But of course, you can't go by amateur popularity on which moves are good. You have to turn on the engine. So if we turn on the engine says bishop e6 is the best move. And after knight e5, you can play queen d4, hitting the bishop and the knight. So let's show you that. Bishop e6, and he moves the knight to the middle. Queen to d4, hits the bishop and the knight. He has to try to save them. If he plays knight takes c6, then queen takes a4. So he's going to play bishop c6 check. Knight takes, and now I'll move like queen c5. And the knight is getting trapped. For instance, if he tries to save it with a move like queen to a6, we could remove the guard, bishop to c8, queen to a4, and then finally bishop d7, and the knight falls. All right, let's go back to the game. So after queen e2, black played bishop d6. White hits the pinned pawn. Let me take some of these lines off. They're left over from me reviewing the game with my student. d3 hitting the pawn. He said, okay, now I can castle. And if he takes the pawn, I can take back with the knight, and he can't take with the queen because I pin his queen to his king, which is true. But the engine says, oh, now that the bishop is not on this diagonal, the better way to do it is to play bishop to a6. That's not clear, but my student played this move relatively quickly. And after the engine played, I mean, he's playing a mid, he's not playing an engine on a high level. I think he's playing what they call Stockfish level 5, which is probably, somewhere in the 1600 range maybe. So he takes knight takes e4, and my students, in that same rough range as well, maybe slightly below that. So he plays knight takes e4, and of course the engine castles. And now my student plays a really good move, but he plays it for a reason that he didn't realize. The engine says his best move is rook e8, but it says his move is also just as good, which is knight c5, which has a double threat. And my student didn't realize it was a double threat. He thought it was just a single threat. And now the engine makes a mistake. The engine's only safe move, the only move to save the game, is bishop to b3. And you'll see why in a second. Instead, the engine plays the blunder knight to c3. Let me take those lines off again. And now my student can play and win. What's the winning move? Well, you probably see it. If you don't, the engine's going to tell you, but you can always cover it up and try to figure it out yourself. The answer is the knight on c5 is guarding the a6 square, so black can play bishop to a6, skewering the queen and the rook on f1, and winning the exchange, and white has basically no compensation. And after bishop a6, which I certainly saw in the game, black would be just winning up 2.3 pawns. But here again, he made a criticality assessment error. He quickly said, oh, I can win the bishop pair. I can take off that nice bishop on a4 and make his knight go on the rim. So he played this move in just a few seconds. He didn't say, well, I have a good move, knight a4, let's look for a better one. He didn't say the queen and the rook are lined up on the diagonal like I talk about in my video, the geometry of chess tactics. He just simply took the bishop very quickly. And after the game, I showed him this position and I said, you have a much better move. And then finally he found bishop to a6. All right, so he takes their criticality assessment error. More than anything else, he just didn't realize that he had, when you see a good move, have a better one, but he didn't realize there might be a better one, and there certainly was. So knight takes a4, and now the engine says that white is better. White's up a pawn, and that knight on a5 is a little hanging. Black plays bishop to g4. The engine says white should put the question to the bishop. I always tell my students, you want to do this right away. You don't want to let this pin hang over you. You want to know what that bishop's going to do. So unless bishop takes f3 as a threat, which it's not, if it is, you can't play h3, then you should probably hit the bishop right away, and this is no exception. The engine says h3 is the right move. White instead plays bishop to e3, a developing move. Now the engine says that black should play bishop takes f3. If white plays the normal-looking queen takes, that loses instantly to the double threat queen h4, threatening mate and the knight has to fall because black is not able to be stopped for both threats. White can stop the mate, of course, but then he loses the knight. So better for white on bishop takes f3 is to take with the pawn, and now when the queen threatens mate, white can block the mate and block queen takes a4, but at the cost of losing a pawn. Bishop takes, threatening mate again. Bishop takes, queen takes, let's say pawn here guarding the knight, and now black develops the rook. If white moves the queen to the middle, then the other rook comes over, and black is back to even in material, but white's king is exposed, and black's ahead a couple tempos in development and is controlling the middle of the board. So even though both knights are on the rim, this position is basically kind of winning for black. All right, so back to the game. So my student missed that. Bishop f3. Instead, he plays queen f6, putting more pressure on the knight on f3. It's a very reasonable looking move. And now white plays a provocative move. He plays knight to c5. And that unguards the pawn on b2, but should black take the pawn on b2? Is there a trap? Well, my student was correct in, looking around to see if it was safe to take the pawn on b2. He has other candidate moves. The engine says the right move is to do the same kind of trick again. Play bishop f3, and if white takes with the queen, play queen e5, threatening mate and two pieces attacking the knight. If white now plays, well, if he plays bishop to f4, you just take it off. If he plays queen f4, you just take it off, and you're just basically when he stops the mate, you're just winning the knight. So again, we have the same kind of idea, and this time if he takes with the pawn, it doesn't help him anymore. Not only does black have bishop takes, and queen checks, but he could even check first with the queen on g6, not trying to win the knight, and now maybe play queen h5 with these double threats again. And the engine has him up. Here the only way to stop the mate is to lose the queen. f4 is the only move to stop mate, and queen takes e2. So very clever by the engine. The engine says, I could win a piece, but I have better than winning a piece. I could actually win the queen. You don't see this kind of combination very often, where you win the queen by threatening mate because he has to block the mate, and in doing so the queen's not saved. Very cute by the computer. All right, so that was the best idea. He saw that he could take the pawn. He wanted to make sure it was safe, but he didn't look for a better move. So it was a fairly critical position, and the engine's showing us all kinds of beautiful tactics based on these removal of the guards followed by these double threats. Good stuff to study, and in your games, if you ever see something like that, maybe it'll trigger something that you can get those double attacks. All right, so white simply counterattacks the bishop on d6, and now I thought that black should play rook on a to d8, and I think the computer, after looking a while, said it didn't make a big difference which rook did. My student was worried about losing the pawn on a2, and I said to him, you know, if I can get my both rooks in the center and start winning his queenside pawns, I'll give him the 3 or 4 tempos it's going to take, because if you play rook a d8 and then you play rook f e8, pinning the bishop, it's going to take a while for white to unpin that bishop so it could take the pawn on a7, and he just doesn't have time to do that. But the move my student played, the engine said, is, just as good if not better. He played rook f d8. And now white plays a very strange looking move. He plays a3. And the engine says, oh, here we go again, except now queen e5 can be played on the first move. That's a move that escaped my attention. Queen here, threatening to take off the knight and then mate him, and also threatening to take off the knight. And you might say, but he could just take your queen. And the answer is, well, yes, he can. If knight takes e5, then bishop takes e2, and now we have a counting problem where there's pieces hanging all over the board, and we have to figure out who's going to come out ahead. I use the term counting to mean looking at sequences of captures on multiple squares or even on one square. Well, counting on one square is usually pretty easy, but counting on multiple squares can be very, very difficult. And here the engine says white's best move is rook takes d6, and after rook takes d6, hit the bishop, and then it says black should save the bishop by pinning the rook, and black's up the exchange in the endgame with a win. That's what happens if white takes the queen. The problem is he almost has to take the queen because all the other moves lose too. For instance, if he takes the bishop, then black has a nice choice of taking with the queen, or he could still take with the rook, and it still works here, and black's up by about 5 pawns. And, he's got to stop this mate. And bishop takes f3 followed by queen takes h2 is the threat. If he does nothing and he plays like g3, black could play for taking this knight for sure, but he could also put the pressure on this knight, and if white tries to guard it, he's just got all kinds of tactics here. Engine says, just take the knight, win the piece, don't get too complicated. Engine gets complicated, of course, when he wants to be. All right, so I certainly missed this move, queen e5. It's an easy move to miss. It's like, why would you want to put your queen on a square where the knight can take it? But actually, it's by far the best move. You could take the knight first and then put the queen on e5. That's not as good because, again, he could take with the pawn and do some tricky stuff and only be down 2.7 instead of 5.3. My student, of course, was not looking at any of that, and I have to agree that in a 30-10 game, it's very, very easy to miss that stuff. He says, can I take the pawn on a3, and then if he plays rook a1, can I save my knight? So he took some time figuring that out, and that he definitely should. You don't want to just take the pawn on a3, and after rook a1, find out you're getting removal of the guard on the skewer. So he took the pawn, and white did play rook a1, and he plays his best move, in fact, the only move that gives him an advantage, queen c3. And now white could start attacking that queen, trying to remove the guard with moves like knight e4, but it doesn't quite work. For instance, if he plays knight e4, black has the very clever, this is one of those defensive problems. What does black do to save the knight, save the queen and save the knight? Well, if you play queen to b4, you are hitting the knight and guarding the knight, but then he could take the bishop and threaten to move the rook over and try to get the queen out of the way again. So the better move is to play queen to c4. This is a common defensive idea, which is white can't take the knight on a5, rook takes a5 because the queen takes e2, and if queen takes c4, then knight takes c4 saves the knight, and that gives you a chance to save it. If you've never seen a defensive tactic like this, you might want to stare at this for a while, do a screenshot or something, because it's a really good idea to have. All right, so let's go back to the game. In the game, white played knight a4. Well, that hits the queen, but it blocks the rook from attacking the knight, and it puts the knight on the rim, so it's actually a pretty bad move. And again, queen e5, for all the same reasons we saw before, is the best move. But once you miss that once, it's pretty easy to keep missing it, even if your queen's attacked here. So my student played the very reasonable but not best queen f6, putting the pressure again on that knight. And now he's, instead of being down a pawn, he's already won the b pawn and the a pawn, and now he's up a pawn. So white plays knight c5, which is, he has nothing better. And now my student thought he would just start trading a whole bunch of things off. I thought it was a little dangerous to give up the bishop here so easily. The engine says, unless you see that queen e5 trick, that bishop c5 is as good as anything. So he takes, white takes. He says, let's trade everything off. White has to take with the queen. If he takes with the pawn, queen g5 check wins that bishop again. So he has to take with the queen. Black, of course, messes up the pawns for the endgame. And now black saves the knight by bringing it into c4. Now white could take the pawn on a7, but when he takes the pawn on a7, black's going to immediately start attacking the weak pawns with like rook to d2 and knight to e5. And the engine says, after rook takes a7, bishop takes a7, that white's no better off than if white doesn't take the pawn. Now, most human beings are going to take the pawn, but the engine plays a move that's just as good as taking the pawn. But as I said, a human would certainly take that pawn on a7. So the computer plays rook fe1, says, if I take the pawn, it's not any better than doing this. My student's very happy. He says, let me save the pawn. The engine said, when I say the engine after the game, which is Stockfish 14, as opposed to the engine during the game, which is like, 2,000 points weaker. The engine playing white, as I said earlier in the video, is just a mid-level engine playing at like 1600. The engine that's giving us all these brilliant tactics is Stockfish 14 here on Lead Chess. So here it says black should play counterattack with rook d2. He understandably saves the pawn. White plays rook a4, hitting the knight. Now the knight's got to be careful. A lot of the squares the knight can go to are going to be easily attacked by the rooks and the bishop. So it's very easy to misplace the knight in a position like this because the knight can't get back to a safe square. So he plays knight d2 to hit the f3 pawn. And here white should obviously play king g2, get the king in the game to guard that f3 pawn. Instead he ties up the rook a little bit to guard the pawn, which is not nearly as good. And black plays a really good move. He hits the bishop. And now it's interesting, just like the knight had not too many moves because the bishops and the rook could get it, the bishops here also has very limited scope in where he can go. So he moves the bishop to the middle of the board, but it's easily attacked by the other rook and the pawn. So black finally develops his queen rook and attacks the bishop. White saves the bishop. And now black plays his absolute best move, rook g5 check. And now the only move that, well, white could play rook to g4, but then knight takes f3 check and removes the guard. If you've never seen something like that, it's pretty easy. Rook here, knight check, and no matter how he gets out of check, the next move for black will be rook takes g4. I guess he might even have a mate if he goes to the wrong squares, but in any case, you're winning at least the rook there. So therefore, his only other move is to play king there, and now my student found the basic tactic, which is play knight takes f3, threaten the mate over here on g1. I think there's a name for that mate. Is that the Anastasia's mate? I always get these names confused. Threatening the Anastasia's mate, and of course white can't play rook takes f3 because rook d1 check will mate in 2. So white has to play the only move he can, rook a1. My student didn't figure that out. I said, when you threaten a mate like this, you pretty much have to figure out what white's going to play to see what's going to happen. And here, it's easy to figure out rook a1. It's the only move that white can play. And he does. And black says, all right, now I need to save the knight because he's threatening to take the knight now that the back rank is covered. So he saves the knight. White pins the knight with the rook. Black guards the knight with the pawn. Now if white wants, he could take off the pawn on a5. Rook takes a5 is the best move. Notice black can't take the pawn on c2 because the knight's pinned. So rook takes a5 would win the pawn. White figured, well, I'll just guard the pawn and I'll win that pawn on a5 later. Black says, you could get the pawn on a5, but I'm going to be up a healthy pawn in the endgame anyway. And now my knight's in no danger of getting trapped on a nice square like e6. White trades the knights. He finally takes the pawn, threatening to pin the knight to the king. The knight comes back. White plays h3, and now white's king is blocked out of the game on the h file. black brings the king toward the middle with king f8, but actually that doesn't quite work here because the bishop's guarding the squares and the rook can keep checking. So the better way to get into the game is to play king h7, king g6, and come up on the white squares. And that white really can't stop. So he plays king to f8, rook there blocking in the king. He says, whoops, let's go the other way. That was good of my student. He admitted his mistake and he went back the other way. That's something a lot of people don't want to do, but you really, a lot of times you should say, I was wrong, let's do something else. All right, bishop d2 hits the rook. The rook could stay on the g file, keeping the king blocked in. Instead, he hits the pawn, but that forces the king to come up. First, he checked him, which I don't like, forcing the king to come where he wants to go anyway. And now white should play king g2, guarding the pawn and guarding the h3 pawn. He plays king g1, but that allows the knight a whole bunch of tactics on knight d4, which would win a pawn with multiple threats. Knight d4 threatening knight c2 and knight f3 check. My student misses it. He goes back to his plan of bringing the king up. White says, let me attack that pawn, even though it's well guarded. Black hits the bishop. Bishop hits the pawn, which is again guarded. Here, probably you could bring the king up to h5 and start putting some pressure on the h-pawn. Black decides to play f4. White plays the bad move, king to f1, and now the bishop is getting trapped because the king can be attacked along the first rank, and after f4, if bishop c1, rook d1 check wins the bishop. So now the bishop's trapped. And this is one of the most critical positions in the game. My student still had lots of time. He had probably more than 10 minutes left here with a 10-second increment. And white plays rook a6. And here you have to say, hey, I've got that bishop trapped, and he's hitting the knight. Well, the bishop's still going to be trapped after you save the knight. There's no reason to play any other move than to save the knight with the king, like king to f5, and then you win the bishop. But my student said, oh, I can trade off the pieces here and I'm up a pawn. Not only is that bad logic because he can win the bishop and still save the knight, but it's also bad because when he takes the bishop and white takes the knight, the rook is double attacking e3 and checking the king, and white's going to win the pawn and get to a dead draw. So instead of winning the bishop and being up a whole bishop, he ends up being completely even. So the engine says here, if he guards the knight with the king, king to f5 or king to f7, then he doesn't want to keep the knight pinned because if king f6, then bishop takes f4. But if he plays king f5 or king f7, he's up 6 pawns. Any other move, he's not even winning. And this move he played very quickly. Again, criticality assessment error. Pawn takes. Oh my goodness, what a terrible move. I was like, oh my goodness, how could he do that? Rook takes e6 check, king f5, rook takes e3, draw. Okay, white has 3 isolated pawns and black only has 1, but rook and pawn endgames are tough to win when the material is even, and even though the black king is better here and black is a little better, white just can save the game with just reasonable play here. So black plays g5, and now white makes a terrible mistake. He allows black to trade rooks. He plays king to e2, and the engine says, rook e5 wins. This endgame with the isolated pawns is a draw if it's a rook endgame, but it's a win if it's a king endgame. So black plays the right move. Rook e5 should be winning. White moves the king, and now what black has about 8-9 minutes left. He should calculate whether rook takes e3 wins. Even if it doesn't win, it's probably your best chance to win because you're better with your better pawn structure in the king and pawn endgame, and in the rook and pawn endgame, it's going to be really hard to win rook and pawn endgames. It's much harder to win. It's much harder to lose. Sorry, I should say it the other way around. It's much easier to win king and pawn endgames when you have a slight advantage than a rook and pawn endgame. In fact, it's not even close. So he should really stop and calculate, but he doesn't. He plays a terrible move. He plays king f4, but now white can just move the rook away, and it's back to being a draw again. But the engine's a weak engine, and he takes the rook, and Stockfish 14 says, oh my goodness, this is a completely winning endgame. So black takes, and white moves his king up, and now black says, well, I think maybe h5 followed by g4, h takes g4, h4 probably wins. He said, but I'm down to like 7 minutes and 50 seconds. I don't want to calculate that. I don't think I have time. So after the game, he said, if I spend 3 or 4 minutes calculating that and it turns out it's a draw, then I just lost 3 or 4 minutes. And I said, no, for 2 reasons. 1, if it's a win, then you're going to play it. And 2, if it's not a win, in calculating that, you figure out what other things are happening so that you're able to figure out best moves and you're able to see what's going to happen anyway. So you're not really wasting time by doing that because you're seeing what's going to happen in that time anyway. So instead, he preserves his time by playing king to d5, which actually still wins. But as you could see, his idea of h5 is even better. So he even said, I think h5 probably wins, but I don't want to figure it out. And after the game, I said that was one of your biggest errors was you should take some of your 7 minutes and 50 seconds. You've got an increment. So white plays f3. Black plays c4, and now white sees that he's lost, and white plays what engines sometimes do, which is they see they're dead lost, and therefore they play just a give-up move, but they should play it like a human. So let's show you what a human would do and why black's winning, and then we'll go back and show the silly end of the game. Let's say white plays king d2. Black would come up and get the space. White's in trouble here. He doesn't want to let the king in. He would play check. Black would play back, threatening to come up to f4. White would stop him, but now black has extra tempos that white doesn't have, and he simply plays h5 and puts white in zugzwang. If white moves his king straight back, you come up, he tries to block you, and now you have another tempo to get the second thing you need. You push the pawn, and now whichever way white's king goes, you bring the black king in, and you win the endgame. So this endgame was completely winning. If white would play a reasonable move like king d2, which is what a human would try. Instead, black just throws away all his pieces because he realizes he's lost. That's what computers do sometimes when they see they're lost. But, you shouldn't do that. Make your opponent find the win. Don't just give it to him. So my student takes, and the rest of the game needs no comment. King d2, king e4, king back, king up, king there. He wins the other pawn. The king comes up. Now my student should just play king to g2 and queen the f-pawn. He gets a little silly and he pushes the pawn. It doesn't hurt him any, but just... And now he's starting to think, oh, can I stalemate him? Or am I in any danger? And then he gets this far and he goes, wait a second, I can play king e2 and just queen my f-pawn. Which he now does. And now he says, oh, there's no stalemate here because white has a pawn move. I can move my king over and checkmate him, which is true. You always want to stop and make sure it's not stalemate. I've seen a lot of my lower rated students play moves like this when there was no pawn here and the game's a stalemate. So he did the right thing. He took a little time here. He still had 7 minutes and some seconds left because the last few moves he played pretty instantly. He moves up and of course it's mate on the next move. Alright, hopefully you enjoyed the video. We will see you next time. If you liked the video, you can do a like. If you haven't subscribed, you can do that. We have about 6,000 subscribers. But the best thing you can do is pass the word on the channel, Dan Heisman Chess. Thanks a lot. We'll see you next time. Bye.